Welcome to this very special edition of Texts in the City. We are joined today by one of Australia's leading poets. Chris Wallace-Crabbe is a poet and a reviewer and critic of poetry. He's the chair of the organisation Australian Poetry, and he's especially qualified to talk about our featured poet today, Gwen Harwood, because he was a personal friend of hers too. So over the next half an hour or so, we are going to explore a bit of Gwen Harwood's poetry, but as prompted by students from Camberwell Girls Grammar and from St Michael's Grammar School. So they've selected the questions that I'll be putting to Chris today. They've thought up these questions to specifically help them on their journey towards the VCE English exam where they're studying Gwen Harwood's poetry. So they've chosen the questions, but one for me to start with. As something of a novice about Gwen Harwood's poetry, Chris, could you give us a bit of for me anyway, could you give us a bit of a general introduction to who Gwen was?
Certainly. She was both a deeply passionate Australian poet and a great scallywag of the poetry scene, pulling lots of tricks of various kinds, having false identities and so on. But going back to what we can only presume to be the real Gwen Harwood, she grew up as a very bright girl in Queensland. Particularly her adolescence was during World War II, and she worked in a public service department there and wrote very naughty letters to her friends about what it was like there and what a pack of idiots she was working for. And then she married a very scholarly gentleman, and he got a position as a professor at the University of Tasmania in Hobart. So, and it runs right through her poetry, she had moved from the semi-tropical north of Queensland to the cool, bright, unspoiled landscapes around Hobart. And these things inform her poetry very strongly. But from the beginning, there's also a great pang of loss or sorrow or something missing. And I might read a poem to begin our conversation, Jenny. Here's a poem that encapsulates many of the things that are most powerful in Gwen Harwood, I think. It's called Triste, which means sad, sad. In the space between love and sleep, when heart mourns in its prison, eyes against shoulder keep their blood-black curtains tight. Body rolls back like a stone, and risen spirit walks to Easter light, away from its tomb of bone, away from the guardian tents of eyesight, walking alone to unbearable light with angelic gestures. The fallen instruments of its passion lie in the relic darkness of sleep and love. And heart, from its prison, cries to the spirit walking above, I was with you in agony. Remember your promise of paradise. And hammers, remember me. So the loved other is held for mortal comfort and taken, and the spirit's light dispelled, as it falls from its dream to the deep, to harrow heart's prison, so heart may waken to peace in the paradise of sleep. And what's striking about the poem, among other things, is sexual passion, the sense of loss, and the Christian terms of reference, the rolling back of the stone, the spirit walking above.
Well, that's a great place to start then, because one of the first questions that Camberwell Girls Grammar Year 12 literature class would like to put to you, Chris, is about Harwood's connection to religion. And can you comment on her relationship with religion and how that's reflected in her poetry?
My sense is that she was a Christian throughout, but it often comes at odd angles. There's a fascination with religious music, with the figures of angels, with the elements of death and resurrection, so that many people living inside a culture that has got a deeply Christian background are well aware of issues of Jesus, crucifixion, resurrection, eternal life and things like that, without necessarily being dogmatically committed to this or that. But her poetry is full of a Christian culture and its reference.
And did she see these things as literal? Were they the way that she interpreted the Bible, for instance, or they're more metaphorical and figurative?
I don't think anything was ever literal in Gwen Harwood. I think she was a very subtle poet and aware of the layers of metaphor that language is full of, and the layers of metaphor that our common symbols are full of.
Are there particular poems that you would direct students to have a look at if they're interested in this particular aspect of her poetry?
There's a late sequence about Eve, which is very powerful. That's certainly one. So at one end of a scale, she's very satirical and so on. On another end, there are Songs of Eve, a late cluster in which she imagines Eve from the first book of Genesis, but at a different angle, or at several different angles. Sometimes, too, a religious text will start her off. There's one called Mid-Channel that is basically about fishing, but starts from a religious text. The days shall come upon you that he will take away you with hooks and your posterity with fish hooks. And then she's talking about actually fishing off the coast of Tasmania.
Right. And what about music? This is another question that concerns the students. Music seems to affect Harwood's poetry both structurally and technically, as well as through its content. Can you talk about this, or say why music was so influential in her poetry?
I think very early in the piece she sang in a church choir in Brisbane. She then played piano and organ, I think all her life. And I think she continued playing in a Protestant church in near her home in Hobart a great deal. So her mind was full of the language of music and the passions of music. On the other hand, she can treat it comically. She has one of her comic figures, invented under one of her pseudonyms, is called Professor Krote, K-R-O-T-E. And he's a European musician who's come to Australia, who's nurtured on the German and Austrian musical tradition, and finds Australia utterly boring. And he's portrayed as a comically displaced figure, odd, ill at ease, wanting to cause trouble, etc.
Can you tell us a little bit about these imagined selves and imagined lives of Gwen then? Who were some of the pseudonyms that she wrote under, and how far did she inhabit those personas?
Yes, there were a bunch of them. There was Miriam Stone, who was the solid figure, and one beautiful poem is given to Miriam Stone at least. But she's a solid housewife who does the cooking and believes in traditional values. Then there are Francis Geyer and Walter Lehman. Geyer is one who guides us, who plays with us, who tricks us. Lehman is one who pretends to be ordinary. And then when the 60s come along, and the world of the 60s, the whole hippie world that came to Australia in the 60s and 70s, she invents a really hippie character called Timothy Klein, which translates as Tiny Tim.
Right.
Taking off the musical figure in that way. And she gives them different bunches of poems. As time goes on, more and more of the poetry and more of the discernibly serious and passionate poetry comes from the name Gwen Harwood.
That's so interesting, isn't it? So
go on.
Well, do you think that it was when she began to write in those personas, did she create a character that she then felt she inhabited in order to write in that way, or did she write things and then ascribe them to different personalities?
Betwixt and between, I would say.
Right.
There was a bit of both. She'd been used to changing. Her first poetry, which was published at the end of the 1940s, she published under her maiden name, Gwen Foster. And then there were a number of years of comparative quiet as poet, in which she was bringing up the children and so on. Then she emerges as Gwen Harwood. But different poems of different kinds, particularly the playful or wickedly naughty ones, come out from under these pseudonyms.
Right. And did she write differently depending on whether it was a female or a male pseudonym, would you say?
Yes, somewhat, yes.
In what respect?
Well, early in the piece, as I said before, Miriam Stone gets the solid housewife's role more than the others. And Frances Geyer gets some of the playful, sardonic, witty, mocking poems.
So the women were more responsible and stately in a way. And, how interesting.
But she also did other things. She also produced what she called Sappho cards, which were postcards made from cutting out old half-tone comic strips out of newspapers and magazines, sticking them together to make a new card, putting balloons out of the mouths of previously serious characters, and then sending them off to people. And they often had comic poems attached to them. I remember one that was sent to me, which had a picture of Egypt and the pyramids on one side, and a comic poem that began, "Oh, to be in Egypt and Wallace-Crabbe were there."
Do you still have it?
Yes, I do.
What a wonderful thing. That sounds like I would recommend people spend some time doing that. It sounds fun. A clever question from the students. They're asking if they're largely autobiographical, why are the poems so ambiguous?
Well, I could say that all autobiographies are also ambiguous, but I don't think a poem can ever be the same as a frank, in-your-face utterance from someone who just says, "I'm suffering from cancer and I've been suffering from it for years and it's getting slightly worse, but I have good medication and the doctor comes to see me so many times," and so on. Instead, when you make experience and language into a poem, you are making an object, a work of art, and it has a shape and has a coherence, and it doesn't just trail off back into life, but it has, as Danny Kaye once said, a beginning and a middle and an end. And so it's part of the making of art, just as paintings and novels are not autobiographical, really, not utterly autobiographical, nor is a poem. A poem has to have its shape on the page, its shape in the voice, its music.
So in a way we shouldn't be misled by the fact that because it's words we shouldn't believe that it's too literal and a representation of what happened to Gwen.
Exactly. And for instance, the poem that has down the beginning lines of it, a sonnet, has F blank 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 all editors, doesn't necessarily mean that she'd done with editors or done with publishers.
Although that on the surface would feel like a fairly unambiguous statement.
Absolutely.
Landscapes seem to permeate much of Gwen Harwood's poetry, and I think this is particularly interesting given what you'd said, that she moved from Brisbane down to Tasmania, or Queensland to Tasmania, both incredibly rich landscapes. So do you think that the landscape and environment were linked to Harwood's sense of identity?
Very strongly. When she got to Hobart, she found herself in a much smaller capital town where it was very easy to get to the country, with a great mountain looming over the city. Quite soon they started holidaying a little bit down the coast from Hobart, fishing, as I said before, going offshore to Bruny Island, which was shadowed over by the fates of many of the last Tasmanian Aborigines. They weren't the last, as people had thought at the time, but many of those who remained from the original population left their ghostly mark on Bruny Island. And I think she and her husband and children spent a lot of time in boats, fishing and sailing and things like that. So that reinforced her sense of a Tasmanian landscape that often included sunrise or sunset, water birds, the shore, the changing light of morning and evening and things like that. It was into these that she could write her meanings. She could write her life into this low-angled sunlight, these cold, often coldish, clear, bright, beautiful shorelines.
It's an incredibly evocative place, Tasmania.
It is magical.
It actually reminded me when I travelled there a little bit of Scotland. The scale is very similar. There's a lot of coastline and people live close to the coast in a lot of places, and fishing's important, and that quality of light that you mentioned as well. And I think that's reflected in lots of the Scottish poets'
That's right.
work too.
They ought to send Neil Oliver walking around the Tasmanian coast.
Just related to that question, are there particular poems where you would direct students looking for landscape and environment, or perhaps they're all through her work? But
The Sea Anemones is certainly one. Evening Oyster Cove, which is about the landscape and about the past Aborigines. Estuary, very strongly.
So often the poems are actually titled with the places. They're so closely linked to
yes.
them.
Others, too, are full of landscape, but are elegies for dear friends who've died or old friends who are now much older. Here's one, The Sun Descending, and it's in memory of an old friend, and so on.
That's a nice segue into the next question, which is about Harwood's approach to death. This particular student seems to think it's quite morbid. Do you see death as one of Gwen Harwood's key themes? And if so, why might she write in that particular way?
I think all poets are attracted to death as a subject because it cannot be exhausted. It always confronts us. It is frightful, but also haunting, connected with ghosts. It is connected with the change of mobility, activity, energy, originality, and so on. But I think it also suited her sense of what does life mean? What does Christianity offer to life? What is this talk of immortality? What light does it play back on one? A number of her poems are written after she had begun suffering from cancer, and this question would have loomed far larger for her as a result of that. But yes, quite often, early in the pieces I suggested, it's remember me as though there's someone known who is lost. But increasingly it's also those who have gone into death and death waiting and the bone. One of her late books was called Bone Scan, which is the kind of scanning that is done to investigate the bone for cancer having got into one's skeletal bones, but she always referred to it in a spoonerism. She always called it scone ban, as though you're not allowed to cook scones anymore in the kitchen.
So she obviously was playful with language and things, even when she was dealing with really quite difficult subject matter.
Very playful, very playful. Can I tell a little story about her?
Please do.
One of the very last poetry reading events she went to, I was also present, and it was in the fruit-growing town of Shepparton in central Victoria. And at a writers' festival like this, what commonly happens is that you go as a poet or a novelist, you give one reading, you give one interview, and you sit on one panel. And in this case, the panel was on Sunday morning, and people struggled along to it. And 3 or 4 of us were sitting along there, and Gwen, whose demeanour was that of a dear little old Sunday school teacher with a lace collar over the edge of her jumper, said, "I talked yesterday about my life, but I told an untruth, I'm afraid. Actually, I was an orphan. I was left in a little basket on a doorstep in the slums of Naples with only some biscuits and a packet of dry spaghetti. And along came some nice Australian tourists and found me and were sorry for me and took me home. and that's why my maiden name was Foster. And the audience sort of jiggled to and fro and gradually had the courage to realise that this was funny. But again, she would be funny in a big way.
Yeah.
About big issues like loss or...
And not what people are expecting at first thing, a crack of dawn on a Sunday morning.
Exactly.
We've got a selection of questions from St Michael's Grammar School too. And this first one is about form and about structure. Perhaps first you should explain, just in case some of our students aren't yet familiar, what the ABAB structure is.
It's in most popular ballads. It's in a high proportion of hymns in the hymn book. It's even in advertising slogans. It's in pop songs. And it's what's called a quatrain, a little stanza of 4 lines, and the first and third sometimes rhyme, and the second and fourth almost always do. As in...
I'm putting you on the spot now.
Almost everything is written in it, and now I can hardly think where. The king has written a braid letter and written it with his hand and sent it to Sir Patrick Spens, was walking on the Strand. The hand and strand rhyme, so that the stanza is like a little thing that opens up and closes again, and the second and fourth line rhyme with one another. And that is very common, particularly in popular ballads and things like that.
And it has a very strong rhythm to it, doesn't it?
That's right.
Sort of
That's right. So she uses that a good deal, though she uses many other stanza shapes. Sometimes rhymed and latterly less often rhymed. How
does she use these structures? And this question highlights the poem Kitchen Poem. But how do they use those? How does Gwen Harwood use those structures to develop meaning in her poetry?
In brief, I won't go into Kitchen Poem particularly, but in brief what happens is that the structure of a poem determines the pace. The rhymes can speed it up and slow it down, speed it up and slow it down. You look at the shape of the different stanzas or verses in a poem. The word stanza is the Italian word for a room, and you can see a poem as a house made up of a number of rooms the same size in a regular traditional poem. Of course, as you come on into later in the 20th century, more and more people want to write freely and liberate themselves from these forms. But these forms give a lot of structure.
And when might you choose to dispense with that type of structure, and what can be the effect of that?
You might choose to give a sprawling effect of the passage of time in an ordinary day. You might choose to be writing about something that affects you greatly, but you cannot bring it to an end. And therefore you deliberately leave for the readers the tantalising sense that now there's white paper on the page, and what happens next? Right. Where are we going? Is there an answer to our problems? Is there an answer to our lives? So a free form might raise those sort of questions. Or sometimes someone might be more radical about it. A very radical poet, or, for instance, a feminist might want to say, male poets have been using these forms for centuries. I want to write something that doesn't have that stamp of the male poets of the past on it, but has a different kind of rhythmical effect.
So there can be something almost subversive in choosing not to do things in a traditional way.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Is there a significant structural difference between the poems? We've already talked a little bit about the various pseudonyms that Harwood wrote under, as well as the idea of some being more playful and some being more the persona of the housewife, where things are very orderly. Obviously the content and perhaps the themes of those poems differ, but are they also technically different? Do the structures differ in the way that the poems are set out?
It very often is, but there is no one governing pattern. She certainly uses AB stanzas for some of the Kröte poems to bring out the satirical edge and things like that. But she moves to and fro in as much as the experience demands the difference, the way a poem started out demands the difference, her musical feeling for what the poem should sound like, whether it's shaped like a finely shaped quartet or whether it's allowed to drift like a tone poem.
It's interesting that you say that sometimes she uses the more traditional structure for satirical purposes, because we talked about how you can use non-traditional forms to be subversive, but you can also do that twice, can't you? It can be double layered by using a very traditional structure, but the content being very non-traditional, you can subvert the form that way too.
That's right, that's right. But a lot of comic or satirical verse does use rhyme as well, as in the little couplet when Alexander Pope designed something for a friend's dog's collar. I am His Highness dog at Kew. Pray tell me, sir, whose dog are you? And it would not be funny if Q and U didn't rhyme.
Right.
And limericks, as you will all know about limericks, which are usually saucy or dirty-minded, but the punch comes from the frequent rhyme, the rhymes following one another so closely.
We're running out of time, so perhaps you could identify a couple of your favourite of Harwood's poems and just tell us why you'd like to select them.
I do like Estuary because it's moving on beyond the one I read earlier. It's still got the remember me and the remember this. The remember me has become remember this, and the landscape is charged with the present and past. And it talks about itself. It's a beautiful visual poem, but it also reflects on how we respond to beautiful scenery at dusk. Over the skeleton of thought, mind builds a skin of human texture. And then the last stanza begins, remember this, I will remember this quiet. She is a poet of remembering as well as of perceiving.
And really quite physical too, even when she's talking about the environment, she's constantly referring back to the human scale of things, isn't she, in the body?
Yes, certainly. And then at the end, there's often something much wilder, as in The Owl and the Pussycat Baudelaire Rock, which is very much a sort of 70s and 80s kind of poem. And The Sun Descending, which is another elegy, but it's an elegy that begins with reference to the Oxford edition of William Blake. She often, just as she often goes back to the major composers of the European tradition, she often goes back to romantic poets like Blake and Shelley, and to poets she knew well like A.D. Hope and Vincent Buckley. And I'll just read the last stanza of The Sun Descending to the memory of Vera Kotu. Half a lifetime, and I'm holding your favourite book, dark blue and gold. Your spirit brushes mine. You walk under the shining heavenly shell with me, clean through the solid world. And there's something very typical about this. Early and late, her poetry is aware of or yearns for the sense of spirit or soul within or surrounding or above our ordinary physical and everyday selves.
Which ties back to where we started with religion and things too, doesn't it?
Sorry about that. I can't avoid it with Gwen's poetry.
Could you sum up for us, Chris, why you think that after Gwen Harwood's death, why she should continue to be read and celebrated and for instance, included on the VCE English list? Why is she such an important figure?
Because she so evenly or in balance combines intense passion with the beautiful clarity of art. She is so articulate about it, but at the same time she is so moved. She yearns, she feels passionate, she looks at a landscape and feels it throbbing. She looks at the day, the evening, and imagines what spirit makes of this physical surrounding.
Beautifully put. And just as a final question, you were obviously good friends with Gwen Harwood. Do you have any other little bit of personal anecdote or anything that we perhaps wouldn't otherwise hear today?
Several times in her letters, I'm referred to as Little Chrissy. So she's a very impish relationship we have with one another.
And she was obviously very fond of you.
Oh yes, we were good friends. We were very good friends.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and your knowledge of Gwen's poetry today. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you for the opportunity, Jenny.